Good evening, everyone. I just want to know if you can see me clearly, everyone who is already logged on. If you can you raise a hand or type something in so that I know that you are able to see me and hear me? I got Robert White. All right, folks, so at the top of your toolbar, there is an icon of a hand. If you click on that, I know that you can hear me. Got it. Robert, Joanne, Shika. Okay, I'm assuming that you guys can hear me now. I'm assuming that everything is working in proper order, and I'm going to give people a few more minutes to get logged on before we start. I have a few more attendees that I want to get in the webinar. Also, I want to let you know that if you have questions during the webinar, you'll be able to ask them. If you were able to early, you can download the handouts that are available. If you were not able to earlier, maybe you can take a look at them now. Basically, it's what I'll be talking about and some definitions just in case you needed clarification. All right, I want to go ahead and get started. I want to jump right in. So my name is Dr. Shanelle R. Reid, and this webinar is brought to you by YBE, Your Black Education. And I have a consulting business, and I had the opportunity to connect with Dr. Boyce Watkins and some of the people who are affiliated with his organization, and they asked if I was interested in doing a webinar, and so here I am. I want to give you some background information about me and how I came to decide to speak on this topic and research this topic. To start with, I am originally from Southern California. I live in the state of New York now. While in California, I was able to complete all of my studies. I went through K through 12 education there, undergraduate, graduate, and my doctoral program. While in California, while going through my undergraduate, I would say maybe 6 months before I was graduating with my degree, prepared to go on to graduate school. Initially, I was going to take up sociology. I wanted to get a doctorate degree in sociology of education with an emphasis on African American studies. Well, while I was in my undergraduate program, heading towards my doctoral program, my son had started having some difficulties in school. And so I would periodically go up to the school to assess what was going on, talk to the teachers, see what I could do to help him. And there was one meeting in particular where I sat down with the teacher, and her words were, I shouldn't have to put up with his behavior in my class. And at that point, I was kind of offended. I was very upset. I was hurt because I couldn't understand. He's a good boy. I don't understand what type of behaviors you're referring to. And so at that point, I went back to school and I changed my major. I changed what I was going to do after I graduated. I didn't know what it was going to be like to try and be a teacher. I had no idea what teacher education courses were like. I enrolled in a methodology class, a special education methodology class, and I remember being overwhelmed by the material, by all of the acronyms, by everything, and I wasn't sure I was going to do it. But while I was in class, my professor, she was the superintendent of schools. I believe the district was Palm Springs at the time. And she came to me, she said, I know you might not understand most of this right now, but this is something that you should be doing. We need you in education. We need people like you who are passionate about education. And so I decided to stick with it. I decided to, okay, I'm going to change my major. I'm going to make a difference in education. If not in education in general, I will at least be able to address these concerns, talk to teachers, and be informed about what's going on in my son's life. And so that was my main reason for doing it. Um, it was difficult for me. I didn't understand anything about being a teacher. I didn't understand the rules, the guidelines. I could take the test, all of the state tests, the proficiency tests. I was good at test taking, and so I was able to do those things. But as far as the art of teaching, I wasn't sure. I had been on a job for 10 years. The job that I was on had afforded me the ability to work around the schedule, volunteer in my son and daughter's class at the time, go to school full time. And so I got to the point where it was time to leave that job. I was on the job for 10 years. I said, well, I'm going to walk away from this job and I am going to be a teacher. I'm going to be a teacher. And so I got an emergency teaching certificate and I started at a middle school in Southern California. And I remember when I got in the class, it was a self-contained class. And there were 22 students in the class. And I remember getting in the class and I was thinking, what have I set myself up for? But then I realized that these students connected with me and they liked me and they wanted me to be around and they wanted to find me during lunch and they wanted to talk to me. And I'm like, well, I'm going to be okay. This is going to be all right. And so I had a great first year. And I realized that maybe I didn't have the book smarts to be an educator, but I had the skill set to connect with the students. And so I knew at that point, okay, now I'm going to get a master's degree in special education. Not only am I going to get a teaching certificate, but I'm going to get a master's degree too. And so I did that. And as I'm progressing through school, my son is progressing through school, I did have to spend a lot of time on the campus because I realized that some teachers just were not able to meet his needs. And I wasn't going to let him be the student who was suspended every week, kicked out of class every week. And so I decided, you know what? I'll take off, I'll do whatever's necessary so that I can be in a room with him sometimes. And so that's what I did. Well, years passed, he gets through, things are going well. And I realized that there's something to this education thing when it comes to having people of color in the classroom. I was on a campus that had lots of Black and Latino teachers on the campus, and we had a large African American Latino population on campus. And so it was a well-rounded, well-diverse population. Well, then I went to a different school, and it was still pretty diverse. And so we were able to meet our students' needs. But I found myself talking to parents often whose students not necessarily attended our schools, but maybe other schools about, what do you do when you feel like your son or daughter is not connecting with the teacher, or the teacher has decided that your son or daughter is not going to be successful in their program? And the more I got those questions, the more I wanted to figure out, okay, what am I going to do? What is this supposed to look like? I don't know how I'm supposed to help these parents, but they're coming to me. And what I realized early on is our current educational system is not necessarily set up for our students to be successful. And when I say our students, I mean African American students, I mean Black students. And it just so happens that a lot of brown students fall into that category as well. And so what I realize is something has to give, something has to happen to change education. And so I talked to few different people from different schools, and I said, okay, maybe it's time that I work on a doctorate degree. I said, I felt like I had a lot to say, but I felt like maybe I needed some more alphabets behind my name before people really started to listen. And so I applied to a doctorate program and I got accepted in a doctorate program. And I remember early on you have to think about, okay, what are you going to write about? What is your passion? What is your purpose? What do you want your dissertation to be about? And I wasn't sure at the time. There are all sorts of things in my head, but no matter what, I knew it was going to focus on Black students in education and how I felt the system was failing them. And so I met with different people and I said, okay, this is what I want to do. I want to look at education, and I want to look at education before Brown versus Board of Education and before integration. I want to know what education looked like. And so initially what I wanted to do was interview people who had attended school in the South prior to Brown versus Board of Education. And I actually was able to find a few people, but I felt like my group wasn't large enough. And so I had to go back and I'm like, okay, I need to look at something else. And so what I ended up looking at was, what did African American teachers do in the classroom prior to Brown versus Board of Education to ensure that their students were successful? And so all of this, all that I did prior, realizing that education wasn't necessarily meeting my son's needs and deciding that I wanted to be a part of the change process is what brought me to where I'm at now. And so I want to talk about education prior to Brown versus Board of Education. And I think that a lot of us may have had an opportunity to kind of review information. I'm not saying Brown versus Board of Education was bad. What I'm saying is that there were some unintended consequences that impact our students every day right now. And those are the problems that we have to address, because any students not making it is a problem. And that's what ended up happening with Brown versus Board of Education. Too many students were not making it through. And so in my research, the first thing I did was look at schools. I looked at other people's work. I looked at schools all over the country. I looked at mainly in the South, because like I said, I'm from Southern California, and schools in California were integrated, maybe not by law, but because of the population and the way things were set up, there was a lot of integration. Well, I had to focus my research on schools that I knew that were not. And what the overriding theme was is that schools that were segregated, schools prior to Brown versus Board of Education, there was a sense of community, there was a sense of ownership, and the teachers, the community members, everyone was involved in educating the student. So I guess in aspects, it's whole child idea. Everyone took part in educating these students. And so when I looked at Brown, I said, okay, so if everyone took part in it, what were these characteristics? Okay, so I have a teacher. What does this teacher have to do? Why is this teacher successful? What is different about this teacher prior to Brown and teachers after Brown? And what I was able to do is, through the research, pull out characteristics. And what I found in my research was there weren't specific labels for what they were doing. It was just, okay, this is how the teachers behaved. The teachers truly cared about the students. The teachers believed in social activism. And so what I had to do was I had to come up with words to define those characteristics. And what I came up with was 5 characteristics, 5 roles that the teachers had to fulfill prior to Brown versus Board of Education. And if you look at the notes, you'll see. The first role is advocate. I'm going to read the information that I found on advocate and what my studies directed me to. So the advocate, teacher who practices a teaching philosophy that attributes to academic and professional success among African American students despite poverty, racial discrimination, and the many social inequalities facing African Americans. And so when I gathered the information, I said, you know what? That's a quality. That's something that a teacher has to have. The next was counselor. Well, what do you do on your campus as a counselor? You have to be interested in the moral and political support of the student. What is that the student needs to be able to be successful and to be able to approach academics? And so I said, okay, fine. Counselor, that's another role. Disciplinarian. Now, this one was a little different because I think every teacher feels like they have the quality of a disciplinarian. But the thing was to look at teachers who were able to discipline students and without any recourse. Okay, I'm able to correct you. I'm able to discipline you, but you know, I come from a place of love. And those were the qualities that teachers prior to Brown had. The next characteristic was a parent surrogate. Teachers then, if parents were not available, if parents couldn't step in, then the teachers stepped in. And I think right now we're so focused on what parents are not doing that we forget, okay, the parent is not doing it. Does that mean that the student has to suffer? And so what my study showed me was, well, back then, no, the students did have to suffer because the teachers, the communities, whoever was involved rallied around these students. And the last one was role models. Students needed to see real life examples of what their life could be because prior to Brown, they saw African American teachers. They saw African American administrators. Now, I'm not saying that these schools were fully equipped and had all of the resources. Maybe they didn't. But what they did have were environments where students could thrive, could be successful, and were interested in learning and building up the community. And so that was what I was able to extrapolate from the data. And based on those 5 characteristics, I said, okay, so these are the characteristics of the historical African American teacher. So what's the landscape of education today? What does it look like today? And some of the unintended consequences of Brown was, so when you integrate schools and you pull African American students out of segregated schools and you put them in integrated schools, what do you do with the administrators? Where are the administrators at now? Where are the teachers at? And so one of the unintended consequences is you lose African American educators and you lose teachers. You don't have them anymore because now that these students have been moved to other schools, you have schools that are already staffed. They're not hiring teachers of color. And so you have students who are accustomed to certain type of environments now move to an environment where my job is to teach you. My job is not to care about you. My job is not to nurture you. My job is not to particularly care for you being in this setting. My job is to teach you because the government has stepped in and said that I have to teach you. And so that's the setting that our students moved into. And so we look at student success from then till now. And if you look at the statistics back then, you will see that the number of students who actually graduated, I won't say that they're higher because that would be misinformation. What I will say is that based on the numbers of students who actually attended school and the students who are attending school now, students did better. And so you look at the population of students, especially African American males, and you say, okay, if they're in environments where they're not necessarily welcomed, they're not necessarily wanted, they're not necessarily cared for or understood, what are we going to do with these students? And you have teachers who say, okay, my job is to educate. My job is to educate. And so they go through the drills of trying to educate these students, but what happens when a student needs more than this is how you do algebra? What do we do then? Well, what happens now in our current public school system is, well, the student doesn't know how to do algebra, and so more than likely the student needs to be placed someplace else. And so, in turn, that's what happens. And so we end up with students placed in special education, not because they lag behind, but because their way of learning is outside of what traditional school looks like. And so we have students in special education, and we have students who could possibly be in advanced placement courses, but because they don't fit what the public school system feels like they should fit, they're not placed. And that's what disproportionality is. It is the increased number of students in special education programs or the decreased number of students in advanced placement courses with respect to the population of students. And so that was my reasoning for looking at this topic. If you download any of the notes, you'll see the statistics on African American males in public education. And then, see, it's more than just what's happening with our Black boys in public school. Because if we know only 50% of our males are successful, so you take 10 students and you stand them up and you automatically remove 5 from the population, that leaves you with 5. Well, if that leaves you with only 5, now you got these 5 gentlemen who we would love to go into education, but they're successful. They don't necessarily want to become teachers. They actually have the skill set to do something else, and there's no pull for them to become teachers. And so the cycle continues. We have a teaching population that's not reflective of what we needed to be reflective of overall. And so what I proposed and what I did in my research was, okay, we know what the problem is. What do we do about it? What do we do about it? And before I go to the what do we do about it, I want to give people an opportunity to chime in, ask questions, chat. If you have questions for me, click the question mark symbol at the top so I can go through and answer questions. If you are interested in another aspect of my research, click the question mark, ask questions. I'll be more than willing to go over my research or anything else you're interested in knowing. Okay, so I got a question. And the question is, the statistics was about the statistical information. And the statistical information is based on inner city schools across the country. I didn't want to just look at one particular area because I could have looked at Los Angeles, or I could have looked at New York City, or I could have looked at Chicago, and I know the numbers would be higher. And so what I chose to do was look at schools across the board. I said, okay, gather the information of schools across the board, because all the information is out there. You can get any bit of information these days you want. And so that's what I did. That's where I got my statistical information. Now, that's just for the webinar. My statistical information for my research was, I gathered it all for my literature review. I probably had close to 100 different resources that I used. And I used peer-reviewed articles from people all over the world. That's where my information came from. Any more questions? That was the second one I had on statistics. Historical roles. Okay, someone wants to know about the historical roles. So what I did was, when I got through all of my literature, I needed to synthesize the information. I needed to categorize it. And so I broke down every article and I said, okay, which article says what about teacher characteristics. And none of them particularly said, okay, counselor or disciplinarian or anything like that. Most of them said these are characteristics that teachers must have. And so what I did was, okay, these characteristics shape up to be a counselor. These characteristics shape up to be a disciplinarian. These are the characteristics of a mother or a surrogate parent. These characteristics are those of an advocate. And so that's how I came up with my characteristics. And based on that information, what I did was I created a questionnaire. And I used the questionnaire to evaluate teachers on charter school campuses. And that question came fast. Someone wants to know, why did I pick charter schools? Because charter schools, the charter schools I looked at were the only schools that had homogeneous populations. And I wanted to look at homogeneous populations and look at what teachers did from the past versus what African American teachers did now, because I felt like if I gathered enough information between then and now, what I'd be able to do is come up with strategies for teachers to use right now in classrooms to help teachers who are not African American better meet the needs of their learners. So that's why I chose that.